The rich get rich and the poor get poor. This ubiquitous expression seems simply to be the unfortunate consequence of capitalism. But what if I told you that this phenomenon is not only a result of capitalism, but a necessary cornerstone of Western economic growth? But in order to explain how this has come to be, one must go back to the very origins of employment and economy in America. In this video, you'll come to learn the story of how employment and monopolization shaped America and affects everything today from social mobility to inflation. In the end, you'll see how the American working class willingly gave up their economic leverage for an overdependence on the 1%, but also how it didn't have to be this way. To begin our journey, we must go back to the 18th century to understand the starting point of the company in America. In an era previous to the American Industrial Revolution, the only employers consisted of agricultural landowners and the odd medieval trade. The vast majority of people remained unemployed, dependent only on the land and the sky for sustenance. But all that changed with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s, which brought about the formation of giant textile mills as well as factories for everything from shoes to tools. Fueled by the mass immigration of mainly Irish and Germans who had nothing but their two hands to feed their starving families, the early employee had little to no leverage and was subjugated to a 6-day workweek, working 12 to 14 hours a day for a wage that was barely enough to keep them coming back. It's this desperation of early employees that allowed America to have its gross national product, the precursor to gross domestic product, grow 270% from 1839 to 1859 alone, and for America to see the completion of its first intercontinental railroad in 1869. While desperate immigrants and city dwellers built the nascent company in America, it wasn't until the late 19th century that America would come to see its first monopoly. Just like its ancestor, the company, the monopoly was also preceded by a wave of desperate immigrants who would work for little to nothing, their poverty being the fortune of the 1%, their misfortune being the boon of American economy. Nearly 12 million immigrants arrived at the shores of the land of the free from 1870 to 1900. But just like slaves had built the American economy with cotton, these de facto laborers, choiceless in their need to feed their families, would sacrifice for the economy of America, this time with oil. Following the first commercial discovery of oil in Pennsylvania in 1859, America commenced the rapid exploitation of her natural resources, and in 1870, industrialist John D. Rockefeller would form America's first formal monopoly, Standard Oil. Buying out competing firms and making secret deals with railroads that priced out smaller competitors before subsequently buying them out, Standard Oil was able to drop its kerosene price from 58 to 26 cents a gallon from 1865 to 1870. And American consumers, all wanting to pay the lowest prices, turned away from Standard Oil's remaining competitors. In 1872, Rockefeller would join the South Improvement Company, a secret society between railroad companies and oil refineries that would have made railroads pay Rockefeller rebates for the shipment of his oil, while making them also pay a penalty for each barrel of oil that the railroad shipped for Rockefeller's competitors. While this scheme was leaked and never actually operated, by 1880, Rockefeller already controlled the refining of more than 90% of America's oil, and was now able to set the price of refined petroleum products. It was estimated that Standard Oil sold kerosene for less than the crude oil that it was refined from in order to drive out competition before drastically raising prices until its profit margin was at or in excess of 100%, when those competitors were either bought out or bankrupt. In this way, despite the working class literally building Rockefeller's empire for him, they would end up being the ones having to pay for the mistake of buying his oil and turning away from his competitors, as he would subsequently raise prices on them until they couldn't afford it. Standard Oil would later be dissolved by the US government in 1911 when it was ruled as having violated the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. But the same investors that profited off of this monopoly would use their earnings to invest in other monopolies, such as US Steel, the world's first billion-dollar company that, at its peak, controlled more than 60% of domestic steel production in America. But unlike its precursor, US Steel would never be dissolved as a monopoly. Here's a video of a prairie dog. Like and subscribe. The buttons make cool animations when you do. So far in this video, I've detailed how the rich get richer by investing in large companies in order to use those earnings to invest in even larger companies. profiting off previous economic growth and financing future economic growth. The same economic growth that the poor are all but forced to contribute to, burdened by their financial needs. But that leads to the question, how do the already poor get even poorer? See, on the surface level, most people at least recognize that the poor get poorer, but just can't actually pinpoint the exact reason for this. Obviously, less accountable and learned people wanting to find an easy scapegoat will simply blame all rich people or government conspiracies for the financial distress. But more reasonable and logical persons will attribute this phenomenon to usury and a lack of opportunity. However, even still, while explaining why the poor stay relatively poor, these things do not explain how the poor get even poorer. In order to reconcile this discrepancy, one must factor in the universal constant of all economic growth, also known as inflation. Now that you know the problem, it's time to find someone to blame for it. But like any successful politician, finding someone else to blame for problems that you caused can be difficult because inflation is something that everyone contributes to. Even the rich, even the poor. In order to understand this phenomenon, all one needs to do is look back to a story I've already told. See, all that there is to learn about inflation lies in the story of Standard Oil. Part 1. Inception. First, we start with the inception of Rockefeller's empire, or more specifically, the labor that built it. Just like the poor immigrants and landless city dwellers that built this company more than a century ago, it is the lack of leverage of the poor that allows employers to set the price for labor. There's a reason why minimum wage exists. See, inflation wouldn't be a problem for the lower class if wage growth matched it, but that would drastically slow economic growth. Part 2. Supply concentration. Following the formation of a company, much is still needed in order for its transformation to a monopoly to be completed. In order for this step to be finalized, Rockefeller needed the help of his consumers to take out his competition for him. For without them, he could have never bankrupted those unwilling to sell to him, and eventually come to control over 90% of the domestic oil refining industry. The only leverage the truly poor have is to not buy from oligopolies before they become monopolies. Part 3. Set your price. The final part in the story of Standard Oil and that of inflation is the simplest but often the most overlooked. Once Rockefeller controlled the oil refining industry, all that there was left to do was raise prices until consumers could barely afford it. But here's the kicker. When one company raises the price of one product, no one bats an eye. But when 10 companies, 100 companies, 1,000 companies do it, that's not just price increases anymore. That's inflation, because the only measure of inflation of a currency is the measure of what it can buy. Inflation is the result of consumers allowing producers to raise prices, either by disregarding a slightly more expensive price or allowing producers to take over a market by taking out their competition for them. Inflation isn't just something that businesses have to deal with like consumers, but something that they all directly contribute to with the permission of their consumers. Of course, it's hard to stop the growth of monopolies when one is truly struggling financially. But America didn't always suffer from such relative poverty as great as it was in the age of Rockefeller. And yet, inflation still persists to this day. Starting in post-war America, the 1940s and 50s gave rise to the inception of the middle class when 48% of families owned their own home. And for once, household expenditures for necessities was at 68% nationally, implying that the average family had 32% of their income as disposable income. For reference, average household expenditures for necessities today account for around 84.4% of total income. In post-war America, it's clear that consumers weren't exactly forced to buy from monopolies simply because of their poverty. And yet, inflation still increased at a rate of 2.2% in the 50s. The only explanation for this is that American consumers, even with their 32% in disposable income, simply let the 1% raise prices. The American working class had struggled just to survive for the past century. But as soon as they had some money and leverage of their own, and a moment of respite from the cycle of minimum wage and price increases, they let it all go through inflation. Slowly at first, but then exponentially, until the working class had gone from poor to rich back to poor again. In the end, the poor had gotten too rich for their own good, and not watching where they spent their money. This disposable income that they earned simply went into the pockets of businesses that fueled the growth of the American economy. From 1952 to 2023, the percent share of labor compensation in GDP, or in other words, what part of the pie employees get, has fallen from 64 to 57%, with the rest of this percentage going to investors. In that time, US GDP has grown 65-fold at a rate of 6% a year. The US stock market has grown 179-fold at a rate of 7.6% a year. The cumulative inflation from 1952 to 2023 is 1,049.8%. Today, in the largest economy in the world, 33% of wage earners say that they wouldn't last the month if they lost their income. In 2023, 7% of adults said that members of their household sometimes or often did not have enough food to eat in the prior month. And even still, the American economy shows no signs of slowing, with the S&P 500 index returning 71% over the past 5 years. And to top it all off, despite the average American's apparent financial struggles, consumers still buy enough $7 iced frappuccinos from Starbucks for it to be worth $111 billion? What the hell? If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe to see videos like this in the future. The buttons make cool animations when you do.